Hey everybody, hope you're doing well today. This is the introductory and overview video of macroeconomics. The idea here is that you watch this before you begin your journey into the world of macroeconomics, where you go from the small micro to the big macro and start thinking about economies on a countrywide scale. It's super exciting, and actually, for students, I have found macroeconomics to be something that they can latch onto really quickly because it's kind of what you've seen in the news. When you hear about unemployment benefits and unemployment rates and inflation and economic growth and economic development and these things in the news that seem to surface on a regular basis, those are all macroeconomic concepts. And so I find this unit, this whole part of the IB syllabus, to be really exciting for students. So here's what I want you to get in your mind ahead of time. Look, it's the government's job to be good parents of the country. The analogy of the government being the parents of the house of the country that you live in. I live in Chile, so the Chilean government being the parents, the stewards of all things Chileno, is a great way of thinking about the role of government. Just like parents in a traditional household are the stewards, they're the ones that are guiding the family forward. For better or worse, they're the ones who are in charge. They make decisions, they respond to the realities of the citizenry, of the needs of the students, the needs of the children. Governments are the parents of an economy, and macroeconomics is countrywide. And I like to think of like a big bubble over every country around the world, and that is what macro is. It's the country bubble of Argentina, of Brazil, of Chile, of Bolivia, of Mexico, of Nicaragua, of Afghanistan, of Pakistan, of India, Russia, right? The Philippines, Indonesia. All of those places have a bubble over them. And inside that bubble, the government are the ones who are responsible for dictating healthy objectives for their citizenry. And so in macroeconomic senses, there are four main objectives. Number one is economic growth. Every country should be responsible, right? Every government should be responsible for economic growth, which is a general increase in the incomes of people over time. They also are responsible for keeping the objective of a low level of unemployment. As you get into your unemployment studies, you'll realize that 5% unemployment is actually a really healthy sign for most societies. So the objective is not no unemployment, but that most people in society who want to get a job are able to find a job. And there's a natural rate of unemployment of about 5% that are made up of three different components that you'll get into. But the goal of the government is to keep a low level of unemployment. Likewise, the third goal is low and stable rate of inflation. That should say of inflation, not if inflation. Low and stable rate of inflation, which means that prices will rise at a predictable amount every year, and people can respond. Business can respond in terms of paying their employees a little bit more. But the goal for government is to have a low and predictable and stable rate of inflation. Somewhere between 1% and 2% for most developed nations is healthy. And the last main economic goal or objective of macroeconomic goal is equitable distribution of income. The parents of the country, the government, should be responsible for figuring out a way of distributing income equitably, not equally, not that everybody makes everything, but what do you do with money in your society? Who gets it? What are the tax rates? What are the benefits? What are the social benefits that are there? And the government has an objective of an equitable distribution of income as much as possible. In this introductory series, called The Fundamentals of Macroeconomics, we're going to look at three main things. The first is the circular flow model, which is, if you've watched the videos earlier from microeconomics, this is part of the foundational series of IB economics. We'll take a look at the circular flow model and how money and resources and products flow through an economy. Then the second thing are the measures of economic activity, and this is gross domestic product and her friends. GDP and her friends is the way in which you measure economic activity, whether it be through just straight up understanding of how much the incomes have increased or decreased in a particular country. Do you take into account degradation of the environment? Many factors go into, is it per capita? go into calculating and measuring the economic activity. Of course, the way you measure something creates certain outcomes, so it's a pretty critical thing to understand. And then the last fundamental thing here is the business cycle. And the business cycle is a concept that's really important to understand because you need to know that there are these fluctuations. There are these fluctuations of boom times and recession times and times in between, and it lends a good understanding of the way in which a macroeconomy functions. There's the ebb and the flow of the business cycle. So we're going to get into that as well. But before we move on, a transfer of language to macro talk. And Jason Welker nailed this. In his macroeconomics guide for introductory economics, he put together this chart, and I absolutely love it. Look at this column right here is the microeconomic concept. Okay, put next to the macroeconomic concept. Basically, you're taking words and changing them into something else. You're taking from a micro meaning into a macro meaning. You need to take a screenshot of this and save it. This is like gold for you. So in micro, we talk about markets. In macro, we're going to talk about the national economy as an entire market, right? So it examines all, in the macro sense, all of the economic activity taking place in a country. In microeconomics, we talk about demand. In macroeconomics, we're going to talk about aggregate demand, or AD, which is the total demand for a nation's output of goods and services. So we're going to have an aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve, similarly to we had a microeconomic demand and supply curve. But they mean different things, so there's a change of language. In micro, we talk about supply. In macro, we talk about aggregate supply, because we're talking about the total supply of goods and services by all the industries of a country. In the micro concept, we talk about price. In the macro concept, we're going to talk about the average price level, which is an index of the average prices of goods and services over time in a particular country. Okay, so this will be the vertical axis of the aggregate supply and demand curve. Quantity is, of course, the horizontal axis of the micro economic supply and demand. But quantity, the macro concept of quantity, is national output, which is the horizontal axis of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve. And that's the total output of all the industries in a country. In microeconomics, we talk about a decrease in demand, and what we're going to talk about is the same idea, but it's a decrease in aggregate demand, which we will call a recession, which is a fall in total output resulting from a decrease in aggregate demand. If we have an increase in demand, that's what we called it in micro, we're going to call that inflation, which is an increase in the average price level resulting from an increase in aggregate demand. So as aggregate demand goes out, there's going to be a natural inflation or increase of the average price level. Decrease in supply, right? An inward shift of the supply curve, we're going to call a supply shock in the macro concept, which is an increase in the price level and a decrease in the output from a fall in aggregate supply. So as the aggregate supply curve pushes in, of course, prices are going to go up, but it's going to be a lack of supply. And lastly, in the microeconomic concept, we talked about an increase in supply, but we're going to talk about that as economic growth, which is an increase in the national output resulting from an increase in aggregate supply. So when the aggregate supply curve moves out, it's a sign of economic growth. Okay? So this column and these definitions are golden to you. Thank you, Jason Welker, for putting this together. I love it. Take a screenshot of this and keep it close. This is a great way of transforming your language into the macro world. All right, here we go. Onward and upward of our studies of macroeconomics. I hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll talk to you in a bit.